We're going to talk about the Red Scare of the 1950s, and that refers to an intense fear of communism inside the United States. And we can associate that, of course, with the containment policy the United States was following in terms of foreign policy. So our aim is, how did the Red Scare contribute to an atmosphere of paranoia among Americans in the 1950s? So we see some history here, and we see two different things going on inside our government. An organization inside the House of Representatives called HUAC, and they pursued communists and called people in, the ones that you saw in the videos that you watched. And then in the Senate, we see Joe McCarthy, a senator of Wisconsin, who was the person who was making a lot of accusations in the Senate, saying these people are communists, we need to call them in, and that kind of thing. So these are two different things. And the person who was running the HUAC in the House of Representatives was Richard Nixon. So he really became a household name as a result of HUAC, and then he later went on to become president and wound up resigning due to corruption. That we'll talk about later. Okay, going on to our questions. What is communism? It's an economic system based on common ownership of all businesses and property. It's typically accompanied by a political system that controls the people in order to maintain control of the businesses. It does not allow private ownership of property or freedom of political ideas. Many Americans were fearful and suspicious of communists during this time, because one of the stated goals of the Soviet Union was to spread communism worldwide, and this would lead to the destruction of political freedom and private property around the world. And it seemed as if the communists were gaining ground with the fall of China and the stalemate in Korea. Fix that. Okay. And I left these next two questions blank because they're kind of difficult to answer. It's really an opinion. What does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be un-American? How can you prove that you're loyal? And how can you prove that someone is disloyal simply by how they act or what they think? We know, we've discussed earlier this year, that the First Amendment protects our right to free speech, and generally that's associated with the freedom of thought. And so the government's not supposed to be policing our ideas and telling us how to think. And so during this time, we see the government saying that if you support communism, if you think communism is good, then you are a disloyal American. And that whole idea in and of itself is un-American. Okay, looking at some of these documents. The first document we have is from Joe McCarthy himself. This is a really famous speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, and he says in the beginning that the Soviet Union and communists are growing, whereas the side on our side is getting smaller, so they're really gaining ground on us. He also says that this is happening by the people from within, and that's the idea that Americans inside our own country are being disloyal and helping to advance the communist point of view. And then he says, this is the most famous line, I have here in my hand a list of 205 names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party, and they're working in the State Department. Okay, remember that the State Department is part of the President's cabinet when we talk about the Secretary of State. So this is a really high-level accusation that he's making in this speech. So that's why this is so famous. So what's the source? It's a speech given by the senator who might be concerned about a true threat against the nation, or might be trying to look as if he's protecting the nation for political points. Okay, when we examine this time in history, we have to keep in mind that the people who were making the accusations were acting as protectors for the nation, and they gained political points for that. People like that. They wanted someone to protect them. And they also made political points by accusing people who were running against them as being soft on communism. Okay, so that's something that we'll see. What effect do you think he has trying to make in the first paragraph by saying that they're gaining ground on us? And he's trying to set up the listeners, I should say, to be scared of the growing communist threat. I don't know what I was thinking here, listeners, a couple of typos. The growing communist threat. Okay. And then we talked about this line, when a democracy is destroyed, it means that people inside the United States are working inside with the communists. Why might Senator McCarthy have chosen this quote? Well, it's going to make Americans question their neighbors. The threat will seem very close to home, and they'll want someone, perhaps Joe McCarthy himself, to protect them from this danger. So that's what I was saying when we saw that, certain politicians were trying to make a name for themselves, trying to act as protectors. And he didn't really have any proof. However, there is one very famous spy that was caught working in the State Department. His name is Alger Hiss. And he was tried for being a traitor. And they didn't have enough evidence against him, but he was found guilty of perjury, which means lying under oath. So they never actually were able to prove that he was a spy, but it seemed likely that he was, but they couldn't prove it. All right, so even though we're trying to talk about the paranoia of the members of Congress in this lesson, there really was some truth to the fact that there could have been communists inside the country. So it was mostly paranoia, but there was a little bit of real concern. Okay, going on to our next question, the tone. He speaks as if he's an expert on the issue, and he claims to know about the inner workings of the traitors in the State Department. And how would McCarthy's speech contribute to this atmosphere of paranoia? Well, as an American citizen at that time, I maybe would have been concerned that the Soviets do have spies working at top levels of government. All right, then there's this clip that I asked you how to spot a communist, and the tone is concerned or even alarmist that they're around us. The main point of the documentary is to explain that people were very concerned about the communists during the 1950s inside the country, and that people were actually concerned that this was a direct threat. It impacted how people live their lives. They're willing to join in parades. They're willing to have these air raid drills, and they want to openly prove support for the country. How could this documentary have contributed to the atmosphere of paranoia? Well, it's an instructional guide to spot communists in the neighborhood. So it really did try to encourage people to be on the lookout, thinking that their neighbors could be traitors. Okay, then we have this next clip about the Hollywood 10, and people called in. Hollywood was a target because they said that the films could be used to distort the way people look at a particular issue. And they claimed that Hollywood was making movies that encouraged Americans to be sympathetic to communist ideas. And HUAC did research to find out who was attending the communist meeting, so they would show documentation that people went. And people are allowed to participate in assemblies according to the First Amendment. It's a meeting, and so it seems like the government should not be allowed to trace people's behavior in this way to determine loyalty. Do you think the HUAC investigations could have added to the atmosphere? And I think the answer to that is going to be yes, because people's reputations and careers were on the line, and it would be dangerous to be called into Congress. So people might change their behavior and change who they associate with for fear of being called into Congress. So that's something that Congress was doing. All right, and our last document here is was prepared and released by HUAC, and they talk about what communists do and how it's bad and how it could destroy freedom and take away private property and interfere with our educational system. Do we think this is a trustworthy source? Well, at this time in history, most Americans trusted the word of the government, so they would have believed this. And the people who were running HUAC were concerned that communists were taking over the country, and they seemed to be single-minded on this topic. So people coming in for questioning were almost presumed to be guilty on the basis of very little, if any, criminal activity. Remember, joining a political organization or attending a meeting is not a crime. But because of their focus on this issue, the pamphlet cannot be seen as totally reliable. Okay, then the pamphlet describes communism as one group that seeks to rule the world. And that's not really the primary goal of the communists. In theory, it's to even out wealth, but in reality, it winds up being a controlling political force. So this definition is a little bit of an exaggeration about what communists are. The tone of the pamphlet, it's stating that communism is a threat, and a threat to America and the way of life. It's going to take away people's freedoms, and it's warning the people. You can't own property, you can't get an education. And the members of Congress were aggravating the American public, getting them kind of riled up about this. Okay, so let's go back to our aim. How did the Red Scare contribute to an atmosphere of paranoia among Americans in the 1950s? Okay, so I want you to think about that, and please submit an AIM response on that separate sheet of paper. Have a great day, everybody.